This morning I want to start with you from a completely different and unusual and unexpected place. We have a kind of a routine as pastors and congregants. We kind of have a flow. We know kind of where things are going. But this morning I'm going to start from my past. Rather than taking just right up from the Scripture, I want you to know something. When I was a child, this Scripture used to excite me. There was no other story in the entire Bible that got my attention any more than Jesus and Peter's walk on the water. When it comes right down to it, I thought that was the most amazing thing. I thought it was so amazing that any time I was near a swimming pool, I would take off running on the side towards the water and try to see how many steps I could take. Needless to say, I never made many steps. I'd go off the edge, go face first, and go back to the bottom. I tell you that so that we begin from a same vantage point, a similar understanding. And the lens is simply this. I tried and tried and tried and tried to walk on top of that water, and every time I failed. It didn't matter where I was or whose pool it was, I was going to try. Do you notice the word that keeps coming back over and over and over? I. There's no way I was ever going to walk on that water. Because I, in and of myself, I alone by myself, could not do that. That's where I want us to take our step off this morning. I want us to come from the same place where we realize that we alone cannot do this. From that place, I want us to step into the text. The text begins. There are 3 times in the text that we'll hear this morning. The text begins this morning immediately. Jesus made the disciples get into a boat, go on ahead of him, and go over to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. A couple of things immediately. You will hear this word 3 times this morning. 3 is important for us because in an oral culture, which this would have been, 3 times called attention. 3 times would have made it push the point home, hammer it in a little deeper, calls people's attention to it that much more. So what are they having their attention called to? Well, there's a sense of urgency. If you've ever raised children or been a child yourself, you have either heard yourself or a parent say, I want you to do this immediately. And we know what that means. That means right now. There's a sense of urgency, deliberate urgency. So Jesus sends them on urgently. Now that may sound weird at first. Why would he send them on urgently? Well, I think there's something else interesting here. This is the first time in Matthew's Gospel account where the disciples have been told to do something other than follow. Up until this point, Jesus has said, come, follow me. Come, let's go here. Let's go, and I will lead. You follow behind. I will lead you. Now Jesus says, you go on ahead of me. That intrigues me. That piques my interest. Why would Jesus need to urgently send them ahead? I think the mission of the church is urgent. In verse 23, we picked up, it says, after Jesus dismissed the crowds, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone. Now, I'm not going to ignore the big white elephant in the room. In this verse, we have something that has always made me giggle. So we'll just bring it out. He went up on the mountainside by himself, and later that night, he was by himself. I never understood the need for that. It used to just, it seems so redundant. Why would Matthew need to tell me he went up alone and got there alone? Then I started to think about this oral culture. Every time you start to repeat, it starts to push it home a little more. He was alone. He was by himself. Then when we think back to the scripture that we read last week, he was trying to get away, and he couldn't. The crowds came to him, so he was no longer alone. He needed some time alone. He needed some time to be alone with God. The mountainside, the mountain imagery, the mountaintop, this is very evocative. Moses went on a mountaintop, and who did Moses encounter? Moses encountered the presence of God. When these people of this time heard mountaintop, mountainside, they thought of Moses. They thought of the presence of God. So Jesus goes on the mountain to be alone with God. If that's not beautiful enough, if that's not enough to chew on for a while, think about this for a minute. This is the divine Son of God, showing complete reliance on God. What a great example for us. We're not divine, we're just human. And even the divine Son of God showed dependence on God. At 24, it picks up, it says, "And the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves, because the wind was against it." These winds, these waves, are physical elements. They're of this world. What more blatant symbolism? They were sent on a mission. These disciples were in the boat, sent on a mission. They were to go and do what Jesus had told them, and the elements of this world stopped them dead in their tracks. They could go no further. They had gone part of the way by themselves, but now the wind and the waves stopped them in their tracks. There was nothing they could do. Remember, at least 4 of these guys were fishermen, guys. Folks, these were people who knew water. They'd been out there. They probably tried every trick in the book, and they were still going nowhere. Verse 25 picks up, "Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake." Shortly before dawn, what happens at dawn? The sun comes up. When the sun comes up, it gets light. So shortly before the lightning or the enlightenment, Jesus went to them. Jesus comes to them, and they're in the dark. As they experience Christ, they become part of the light. He went out walking on the lake. This is a critical thing. That for our understanding, for their understanding, regardless of what they thought before, they could have thought this is our rabbi. You know, the language of Rabboni, teacher, friend, companion. They could have even said master and Lord without understanding. But they see him walking on the water, defying the natural laws, and doing what no one on this earth can do. For no one breaks the natural law of God. This is a moment of enlightenment for them. They are seeing the divinity of Christ in their presence. Verse 26 says, "When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. They screamed, 'It's a ghost!' And they cried out in fear." You know, there are some times in the Bible where I think we miss the point. We don't really give it enough note. To say they were terrified, they're in a boat in the middle of the night, they're in a storm, and they see somebody walking on the water. I think terrified might miss it just a little bit. I think I'd be a little more than terrified. And I have been completely content with the idea that it was a ghost, that they saw something uncertain, they were afraid of that uncertainty, until just recently. This past week, as I've been wrestling with the Scripture, I've had something new come to the surface. I want to share that with you this morning. I'm not saying this is what it is, I'm saying this is a possibility that opens a new possibility in the story. They see what they see. They see what they see. The response we have written is, it's a ghost. Now, even in this culture, we have a fear of ghosts. If somebody were to tell my wife that there was a ghost in our house, we wouldn't even pack. We would just move. That's been along the way. All cultures have had their fears of this. But what I want you to think about for a minute is this. Could they have cried out in terror and said it's a ghost, hoping that it was a ghost and not the alternative? Could they have really desired it to be a ghost, that which they could rationalize, rather than it be the presence of God? Because the presence of God can be more frightening than a ghost. When the presence of God draws near, our fear becomes great because we are so unworthy. And they cry out. We pick up in 27, it says, but immediately, there's another immediately, that sense of urgency. Jesus said to them, take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. We've had our sense of urgency. It was not delayed. He didn't wait to let them respond. He didn't let them flounder in their fear. Jesus was intentional. Jesus was there. Take courage. He speaks. We've heard elsewhere in the Scripture where Jesus says, my sheep know the sound of my voice. So they saw him. They're not really sure what's going on. Now they hear it. Well, everything we know, everything we've been told, they should know who it is by now, right? They've seen him and they've heard his voice. They should know what's going on. There are a time or two in the Bible, whether you've got a King James or a New International or a New Revised Standard, there are times throughout them all where we don't translate well. There are times where we translate poorly. This is one of those times. It doesn't change what we have to make it any less, but it will make it more powerful. For in the Greek, when we look at this language, Jesus says, take courage, it is I. The Greek didn't say it is I. The Greek would have translated more closely to, take courage, I am. We've got a whole other set of language going on here. We've got a whole other game going on here because now he's using Yahweh language. In the bush, Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, I am. And Jesus tells the disciples, take courage, I am. Now that just opens up a whole new line of thinking for me. That tells me that we can have courage, plain and simply because Jesus is. Jesus says, I am. God said, I am. And we are told that because that is, we can take courage. 28. You gotta love Peter. You gotta love Peter because Peter will speak before he thinks every time. Peter says, Lord, if it's you. Did that ever catch anybody up a little bit? Lord, if. Big, that's huge. Huge. If it's you. Okay, Peter, you've seen him. Now you've heard him. And he's used Yahweh language, I am. And your response is, Lord, if it's you, shouldn't the disciples be certain by now? They've seen him, they've heard his voice, they've heard the I am language, and yet still, one of them says, if it's you. Because he is human and uncertain. But he follows that uncertainty with this, if it is you, Lord, then have me come to